and welcome back to BHookedCrochet.com. I'm your host Brittany, and in this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to crochet the woven stitch. The woven stitch is a really unique crocheted stitch that can add really great texture to any of your projects. You can work this stitch in a flat piece, and you can also work it in the round, and when doing so you're going to get two different looks because in one option you're flipping your work and the other option you're working continuously around. For this demonstration, I'm going to be using a bulky weight yarn and a size 6.5mm hook. However, you can use any hook and any yarn that coordinates. To begin the woven stitch, we just want to make a slip knot. And the woven stitch needs to be worked in any even multiple. So we want to make sure that our bottom line is a multiple of 2 or an even number. And so for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to make a total of 20 chains. The woven stitch is simply a single row repeat, and it's really simple. When you're working in a flat piece, you're going to skip the first chain from the hook, and we're going to count that as a single crochet, and that's going to serve as an edging for our work. So since we have that to be a single crochet stitch, we want to skip one stitch because that's how this pattern works, and we're going to go into the third chain from the hook to do our first woven stitch. Now, the woven stitch is a total of 2 different stitches. So to begin, we want to yarn over, insert our hook into that chain, yarn over, and pull up a loop. Now we want to make this loop, we want to pull it through this loop here. And so I typically take my middle finger back here from behind and push that strand forward because it makes it easier to work. Then to finish off this part of the stitch, we just want to yarn over and pull through 2. Now we have one more stitch to complete a woven stitch. And to begin that one, we want to yarn over again, insert our hook into the same chain, yarn over and pull up a loop. And this time we want to pull this loop through both of the remaining loops on the hook. And that completes one woven stitch. So since technically we put 2 stitches into one, in order to maintain our stitch count, we need to skip a chain. So we're going to skip one chain, which you can see right here, and we're going to work our woven stitch into the next chain. And we'll just repeat that until we've reached the end of our chain. So we'll skip another chain and we'll work our woven stitch into the next. So when you've made a few woven stitches on this first row, it's not going to look like much. The pattern really starts to emerge as we add more and more rows. So when you've made your last woven stitch, we should end up with one remaining chain. And in that chain, we just want to create a single crochet. That's so we match the other side and we have an edging, so it'll have a neater finish. That finishes up row 1 of the woven stitch. Row 2 of the woven stitch is exactly the same as row 1, but we'll go through it in this demonstration so you understand where to work your stitches after we've already created this first row. So we want to chain 1 and turn our work. And that chain 1 is going to count as a single crochet. We're going to work this in the same way. We're going to skip a stitch and do a woven stitch into the next, and skip a stitch and do a woven stitch. But if you look at it from the side, there's kind of a visual cue for you to know where to put your stitches, and you just want to look for these big gaps right there. That's the stitch where we're going to be working our woven stitch into. And once you've reached the end of the row, you're just going to make a single crochet in the last stitch. Now this one's a little bit easier to see by turning it this direction. We're going to skip this stitch right here, and this one is our last stitch. We just want to make a single crochet right there. One of the great things about the woven stitch is it's reversible. So you can see that the texture looks the same on this side as it does on this side. So I mentioned early on in this video that you could also work the woven stitch in a round. And what I've brought here is to demonstrate to you how exactly you can go about doing that, because it's a little bit different than working it in the flat. However, the stitches are going to be exactly the same, but you have a couple of options. So what I have here is a hat that I'm working on, and you can find this pattern later on this month of January of 2016 at BHookedCrochet.com. This is a woven stitch hat, and I'm working it a little bit differently than I normally would work a hat in the round. And I'm doing so because the woven stitch, when you're working in the round, it has a different texture on the front than it does on the back. So what I mean by that is as I'm working it, I'm working in this direction. So the inside of the hat is facing me. And that's typically backwards of how I would normally work on a hat. Normally, I would be working in this direction and going around this way. But since for this pattern, I like the look of the back of the stitches a little bit better than I do the front of the stitches. And this is completely up to you. Obviously, there's really no right or wrong way, but I wanted to show you the difference in the texture so that you can make that decision if you're going to start a project on your own. It's probably a little bit difficult to see in the video. They're very similar, but on here it has a more bumpy appearance, so you're going to have a more bumpy appearance on the front part of the stitches. And the back of the stitches, you're going to see that nice, like, cool line that goes here. And honestly, that's what I like about the texture for this pattern. So the way this works is as I'm working around, just so you can see where it's going. So if you rotate it as you're working, that's how you'll get to see that this is the back part of the stitches. So I'll go through the motions a couple more times just to kind of show you how to work the woven stitch in the round. As I mentioned, it's going to be exactly the same. We're always going to skip a stitch and work into the next. And in here, the holes are a little bit more defined. So honestly, I don't even look at the top of the stitches to find the next place where I need to work. I just go ahead and find that next gap and work my woven stitch into there. Another thing I will mention is when you're working the woven stitch in the round, I recommend that you don't actually join at the end of each round. So normally we would join with a slip stitch and then chain up a certain number and keep going. But in order for you to get this sort of like offset appearance, see how the circles, those gaps that we're working into, are kind of at an angle? That's because we're working this in a spiral. And so that's also part of this pattern. You can change things up a little bit by joining, and then you're going to have these gaps a little bit more on top of each other. So that's something you can think about if you're going to design your own pattern around this stitch. This concludes our demonstration today on the woven stitch. On behalf of BHookedCrochet.com, I'm your host Brittany. Please stay tuned for more free patterns and video tutorials at BHookedCrochet.com.